Chapter 6. I sit at table with Cernus. I observed the two men, collared slaves, squaring off against each other in the sand. Both were stripped to the waist. The hair of both was bound back with a band of cloth. Each carried sheathed a hook knife. The edges of the sheath were coated with a bluish pigment. "These men are the champions among the male slaves at hook knife," said Cernus. He scarcely glanced up from the game board at which he sat across from Capris of the caste of scribes, chief accountant of the house. I heard the crack of a whip and the command, "Fight!" and saw the two men begin to close with one another. I glanced at the game board. Cernus had paid me little attention, being absorbed in the game. I had not seen the opening. Judging from the pieces and positions, it appeared to be late in the middle game. Cernus was well in command of the board. I assumed he must be skilled at this sport. A blue line appeared across the chest of one of the slaves fighting between the tables on a square of sand some 12 feet in dimension. The line was adjudicated as a point. The two men then returned to opposite corners of the ring and crouched down, waiting for the command to fight again. Without being asked, I had taken a position at the table of Cernus himself. No one had objected, at least explicitly, though I did sense some disgruntlement at my action. It had been expected, I gathered, that I would sit at one of the two long side tables, and perhaps even below the bowls of red and yellow salt which divided these tables. The table of Cernus itself, of course, was regarded as being above the bowls. Hu-Tu sat beside me, on my left. Hu-Tu, the chief slaver, master here. There was a shout from the men-at-arms and members of the house who sat at the tables as the second slave, he who had scored the first point, managed to leave a long streak of blue down the inside of the right arm of the first slave. "Point!" cried the man-at-arms, he with the whip, and the two slaves separated again, each going to their corners and crouching there in the sand, breathing heavily. The man whose arm had been marked was forced then to carry the sheathed hook-knife in his left hand. I heard the odds changing rapidly at the tables as the men of the house of Cernus revised their betting. I heard Cernus announce, "Capture on the home stone," and turned to see Capris sit back in defeat, staring at the board. Cernus began to arrange the pieces once more on the board. "You could have been a player," said Capris. Cernus laughed with pleasure, turning the board. "Take yellow," he offered. Capris shrugged and pushed Uba Spearman to Uba 4. Cernus looked at me eagerly. "Do you play?" he asked. "No," I said. He turned again to regard the board. He pushed his Ubaris Initiate Spearman to Ubaris Initiate Spearman 4, the Taurian defence. There was a cry, and I looked again to the square of sand, and the first slave, with the hook-knife in his left hand, had plunged across the sand, taking a stroke across the chest to strike his own blue line blow at his opponent. "Point for both," announced the man-at-arms. The food at the table of Cernus was good, but it was plain, rather severe, like the master of the house. I had task meat and yellow bread with honey, Gorian peas, and a tankard of diluted Kalina, warm water mixed with wine. Hu-Tu, I noted, but did not speak of it to him, drank only water, and with a horn spoon ate only a grain porridge mixed with bosk milk. At the wall on my right there were 15 slave rings. To each, on furs, there was chained by the left ankle a bare-breasted girl, about whose waist there was knotted a scarlet cord, in which was thrust a long, narrow rectangle of red. About their throats were matching red enamelled collars. Their lips were rouged, and they wore eye-shadow. Some glistening red substance had been sprinkled in their hair. Following the meal, I understood, in the house of Cernus, it is time for the pleasure and recreation of the men. There are games and sports, and wagers and song. Parga and Calenara then, when Cernus would leave, brought forth. "Achille!" cried the man-at-arms with the whip. I saw that the second slave, who was doubtless the better man at the sport, had slipped behind the first, and holding his head back with a powerful forearm, had decisively drawn his sheathed hook knife across the throat of the first man. The first man seemed numb, a heavy blue streak on his throat, and slipped to his knees. 2 men-at-arms rushed forward and put him in shackles. For some reason the man with the whip took the slave's hook knife, unsheathed it, and drew it across the slave's chest, leaving there a smear of blood. It wasn't a serious wound. It seemed pointless to me. The slave who had lost was then led away in his shackles. The victor, on the other hand, turned about and raised his hands. He was greeted with cheers, and was immediately taken to the table on my left, where he was seated at the far end of the table, before a plate heaped with meat, which he began to devour, holding it in his hands, eyes wild, almost lost in the food, to the amusement of the watching men. I gathered the feed troughs in the pens of the male slaves seldom contained viands so choice. Now that the sport was done, some musicians filed in, taking up positions to one side. There was a shihar player, 2 players of the kalaika, 4 flautists, and a pair of kaska drummers. The meal was served by slave girls in white tunics, each wearing a white enamelled collar. These would be girls in training, some of them perhaps white silk girls, being accustomed to the routines and techniques of serving at table. One of them carried a large pitcher of the diluted Kalenar wine, and stepped behind us, climbing the 2 steps on the broad wooden dais on which our tables were set. She bent over my left shoulder woodenly, her body stiff. "Wine, master?" she asked. "Sheesleen," hissed Ho-Tu. "How is it that you first serve wine to a strange man at the table of your master?" "Forgive Lanner," she said, tears springing to her eyes. "You belong in the iron pens," said Ho-Tu. He frightens me," she went. "He is of the black caste." "Serve him wine, or you will be stripped and thrown to a pen of male slaves," he said. The girl turned and withdrew, and then approached again, climbing the stairs delicately, as though timidly, and head down. Then she leant forward, bending her knees slightly, her body graceful, and spoke, her voice a whisper in my ear, an invitation. "Wine, master?" as though offering not wine, but herself. In a large house with various slave girls, it is thought only an act of courtesy on the part of a host to permit a guest the use of one of the girls for the evening. Each of the girls considered eligible for this service, at one time or another during the evening, will approach the guest and offer him wine. His choice is indicated by the one from whom he accepts wine. I looked at the girl. Her eyes met mine softly. Her lips were slightly parted. "Wine, master?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "I will have wine." She poured the diluted wine into my cup, bowed her head, and with a shy smile backed gracefully down the stairs behind me, and then turned and hurried away. Of course," said Ho-Tu. "You may not have her tonight, for she is white silk." "I understand," I said. The musicians had now begun to play. I've always enjoyed the melodies of Gaul, though they tend on the whole to a certain wild barbaric quality. Elizabeth, I knew, would have enjoyed them as well. I smiled to myself. Poor Elizabeth, I thought. She would be hungry tonight, and in the morning would have to go to the feed troughs in the quarters of the female staff slaves, probably for water and a porridge of grain and vegetables. When I had left the compartment, Ho Tu preceding me down the hall, I had turned and blown her a kiss from where she was tied. She had been quite angry, kneeling there, bound hand and foot, fastened to the slave ring by chain and collar, while I trotted off to have dinner with the master of the house. She would probably be quite difficult to get on with in the morning, at which time it would be, I supposed, before I would return to the compartment. It is not pleasant to be bound all night. Indeed, such is a common and severe punishment for female slaves on Gaul. It is less common to bind a girl during the day, because then there is much work to be done. I resolved that most of my problems in this matter might be solved if I simply refused to release Elizabeth until she had given her word, which she takes quite seriously, to at least be civil. But Elizabeth, rightly or wrongly, was banished from my mind for the moment, because I heard from a side door the rustle of slave bells, and was pleased to note that 7 girls hurried in, using the short, running steps of the slave girl, arms to the side, palms out, head to the left, eyes averted, and they knelt between the tables before the men, head down, in the position of pleasure slaves. "Capture of Holmestone," announced Cairnes, moving his first townsman to obey as Builders 1, where Capris had, at that point in the game, been attempting to protect his home stone. The home stone, incidentally, is not officially a piece of the game, as it cannot capture, though it can move 1 square at a time. Further, it might be of interest to note that it is not on the board at the beginning of play, but must be placed on the board on or before the 7th move, which placement counts as 1 move. Cairnes arose and stretched, leaving Capris to gather up the pieces. "Let Parga and Kalinar be served," said Cairnes to a cheer, and turned and left the table, disappearing through a side door, the same through which the shackled slave had been led. Capris, soon after, carrying the game pieces and board, left also, but he made his exit through a door other than that which had been used by the slaves and his guard and Cairnes. Now the girls in white tunics began to serve the strong beverages of Gaul, and the festivities of the evening began. The musicians began to play, and the girls in pleasure silks, hands over their heads, lifted themselves slowly to the melody, their bodies responding to it as though at the touch of a man. "These girls are not much good yet," said Ho Tu. "They are only in the 4th month of their training. It is good for them to get the practice, hearing and seeing men respond to them. That is the way to learn what truly pleases men. In the end, I say, it is men who teach women to dance." I myself would have spoken more highly of the girls than had Ho Tu, who was perhaps overly negative in his evaluation. But it was true that there were differences between these girls and more experienced ones. The true dancing girl, who has a great aptitude for such matters and years of experience, is a marvel to behold, for she seems always different, subtle, and surprising. Some of these girls, interestingly, are not even particularly beautiful, though in the dance they become so. I expect a great deal has to do with the girl's sensitivity to her audience, with her experience in playing to and interacting with different audiences, teasing them and delighting them in different ways, making them think they will be disappointed or that she is poor, and then suddenly, by contrast, startling them, astonishing them, and driving them wild with the madness of their desire for her. Such a girl, after a dance, may snatch up dozens of gold pieces from the sand, putting them in her silk and scurrying back to her master. Suddenly the girls stopped dancing, and the musicians stopped playing. Even those at the table stopped laughing and talking. There was a long, incredibly weird, horrifying scream coming from far away, and yet seeming to penetrate the very stones of the hall where we enjoyed ourselves. "Play!" ordered Ho-Tu to the musicians, and obediently the music began again, and again the girls moved to the music, though I could see they did so poorly now and were frightened. Some of the men laughed. The slave who had won at Hook Knife had turned white, sitting far below the salt. "What was that?" I asked Ho-Tu. "The slave who lost at Hook Knife," said Ho-Tu, pushing a large spoonful of porridge into his mouth. "What happened to him?" I asked. "He was fed to the beast," said Ho-Tu. "What beast?" I asked. "I do not know," said Ho-Tu. "I've never seen it.